Hi, I'm Jarrett Skaddisson, the author of the Kingblade Chronicles, and I'd like to welcome you to the Siloa Press SOUNDSCAPE production of Call of the Danna, the first book of Saga 1 of the Kingblade Chronicles. This soundscape contains the full text of the book, and thus can function simply as an audiobook, but it's actually much more than that. This production has a host of actors who have brought the text to dramatic life, as well as a complete regalia of sound effects and an original full orchestral score. Many people have poured a great deal of time and passion into the project, so it has certainly been a labor of love. It's been tremendously encouraging to me that so many have been so invested in and inspired by this story. And I'm incredibly grateful to all those who have dedicated their time and talents to this work. Now, hopefully this production will help you, the listener, find enjoyment in and be inspired by it as well. The core cast of this production includes Jarrett Skaddisson, that's me, as the narrator, Girion Ringmark, Nagello, Darian Kingblade, and Jiffaloo Timtail. Kyle Rutliff as the voice of Aradis Kingblade. Tristan Starner as Felding Starwash, Tarek Kingblade, Captain Fergezi, and Captain Fordrak. George Glazier as Lodgemaster Goldquiver. Aidan Hallman as Harlan Halehand and Captain Tandarin. Annette Tracy as Rosella Starwash. Luke Adams as Coram Timberfall, and Jason Marfield as Onderrod Torfield and Captain Turney. This production also features the vocal talents, in order of appearance, of Michelle Skaddisson, Ross Allman, Evan Johnson, Lizzie Rose, Krista Marfield, Val Tokarczuk, Bo Sires, Colin Fritz, Phil Schlotterer, and Jonathan Skaddisson. Our audio and sound effects producer was Kyle Rutliff, and our composer and director, Jarrett Skaddisson. Now, without further ado, I invite you, dear listener, to enter the world of the Kingblade Chronicles. The Way of the Tarnodon. The way of the Tarnodon is a road of woes, a path that is harrowed by grievous foes. Ere it is troubled by darkest night, yet he who would tread it must put fear to flight. For the Tarnodon's task is clear and plain. He must battle darkness for others' gain. Indeed, for himself he must have no regard, but passing through fire he will emerge uncharred. He takes up the cause of those who are weak, though he himself be the meekest of the meek. When the powers of shadow upon flesh bear down, and the cries of all mortals in anguish are drowned, the Tarnodon stands in their stead to fight, as a bearer of hope, a bearer of light. When the strength of the strong has at last come to naught, it is clear that a Tarnodon must then be sought. Indeed, all are in need of the Tarnodon. The way of the Tarnodon from mercy proceeds, then on through shadow and flame it leads. Yet death's blade will be shattered and night be no more, and the Tarnodon will stand in glory evermore. Chapter 1. The Coming of the Chassidim. It was just as a late afternoon in the bright month of Elia ought to be in the village of Siloa. Clear, gentle, and full of the promise of summer close at hand. A soft breeze blew across the plains of Agleri, which lay east of the hamlet, and the melodious chatter of an assortment of woodland birds could be heard in the trees of Rimwold Forest to the west. Out on the plains, the farmers were nearing the end of their labor for the day and were preparing to make their way to the Ploughman's Shanty, the local tavern, for many a hearty mug of ale, some warm food by the hearth, and, undoubtedly, several hours of light-hearted conversation. In the forest, the woodsmen would also soon finish their work and join them in town. Indeed, all the hardy folk of Siloa and their families would shortly share food and fellowship, rejoicing in the triumph of spring over another harsh winter, and delighting in the work of their hands and the simple life which they led. There was certainly a marvelous tranquility to be found in Siloa. A hard life it was, to be sure, but there was little in the wide world of Orona that could rival the satisfaction of such an unpretentious people on such a fine spring evening as this. A remarkable peace and contentment rested upon that little village, but none of that precious peace or contentment found its way into the heart or mind of Aradis Kingblade that day. "Aradis!" Girion called out from a ways across the field in which Aradis was drearily heaving a scythe through the standing grain. "If you keep working that hard, dear friend, I'll be surprised if you have any strength left to make it back into Siloa. You've hardly stopped swinging that scythe since sunrise." Aradis, tall and fair in complexion, somewhat slender, with insistent green eyes, a handsome countenance, and a short beard and mustache, had indeed been at his work since the stroke of dawn. Now his rough farmer's garments, consisting of a coarse white shirt, russet breeches, and tall brown leather boots, were soaked in sweat, and his shoulder-length blonde hair lay wet across his neck. Girion, similarly attired, brown-eyed, well-built, and also rather tall, with dark, thick, curly hair on his head and stubble on his chin and cheeks, ran toward him as Aradis replied,
"Well, there's good winter wheat to be harvested, isn't there, Girion? And I am getting paid to work, am I not?"
"Indeed you are," Girion laughed as he came up beside him. "And you've undoubtedly been working harder than anyone else in all Siloa today, or in this whole blessed land of Villaris, for that matter. And I simply think it's time you be done with it for the day. Let's go down to the Ploughman's Shanty and have a nice talk with the other lads, and you can take your mind off of everything. I know you, Aradis. All day you've been out here in the golden grain, just you and your thoughts. And you've only become more miserable as the day's gone on. Do I speak true?" Aradis sighed and leaned wearily on the scythe he had been wielding.
Naturally, I've just been thinking about everything. And, of course, it doesn't help to dwell on it all day. I know that full well. Yet, my labor gives me some consolation. For as it is said, a tired body softens a troubled mind.
"So it does," Girion agreed. "Now, weren't you about to put that in the barn?" he asked, nodding toward the scythe Aradis was using to prop himself up. Aradis looked at his friend with affectionate exasperation.
"I suppose if I don't go stow this scythe and follow you down to the shanty, you won't leave off until I do, eh?"
"Quite correct," Girion said, smiling.
"Very well."
Aradis laughed quietly.
"I will not trouble you to trouble me,"
he said, also smiling a little, and trudged off to the barn to put the scythe away, knowing it would be less than a dozen hours before he would be back to pick it up again. When he emerged, Girion was waiting for him. and the two of them turned and headed west for the 2-mile walk into town through the sprawling farmland. For some time, they merely walked side by side along the worn dirt path that ran through the grain fields, neither of them speaking. But, at length, Aradis said quietly,
Girion, I can't thank you enough for what you're doing for my family.
Girion responded, There is really no need to thank me, Aradis. My mother and father are only too glad to pay you for the outstanding labor you've provided us this spring harvest. And you know it will ultimately serve your family better if you allow your brother to mind the forge while you work out in the fields, so that he also can learn smith's work. Then, glancing at Aradis's rather pensive expression, he exhorted, Now listen to me, my friend. You've really got to quit being so glum all the time. You cannot continue to imagine that things will only get worse. You're already down enough as it is. Take heart. Hard times are the lot of most men. Few are they who never have periods of want and trouble. But know too that these times of dearth and scarcity will come to an end.
In any case, we can hope that will be so.
Aradis sighed, looking back over his shoulder at the golden plains to the east. Girion continued, You remember, I am quite certain, that my family also came upon hard times when my father could no longer fare profitably as a cooper in Aragest, and so we came to Siloa, thinking to make a better lot for ourselves in a farm village of Velaris than in that den of unrest from whence we had come. In truth, my whole family was in a bad way at that time in every regard. Yet, when we arrived, you were a friend to me from the first, and I have not forgotten it, even though 6 years ago that was. Indeed, we were still quite young then. I was but 14 and you 13. Yes, my father, my mother, and I had truly left everything we knew, all that anchored us. But when we found ourselves here in far-flung Siloa, you and your family showed us great kindness and honor. Now it is only right that the kin of Girion Ringmark should give aid to the kin of Aradis Kingblade.
I suppose it is even as you say, Girion.
Aradis conceded.
Things will get better. My father will recover. He must. And I will get enough together to be able to support a wife and start a family. Someday, anyway. The Danna is good to us after all. He knows our troubles, and he will see to it that we are taken care of.
Then he added,
At least, so you tell me, and so my father tells me.
Yes, Girion replied. The Danna sees the troubles of all the Barada, the mortal kin of this world, and he cares for them, and he will take care of you and your family.
Well, even if he doesn't,
Aradis returned.
I will. Mark that. As long as my father remains ailing day and night, confined mostly to bed, I must see to it that my family is fed, and I will do whatever it takes to make that happen.
He finished confidently. I know you will, Girion affirmed. Just then, the lads climbed over a little hillock. The sun had begun to set, and the spring sky was now ablaze with warm streaks of glorious orange and red. Down below them, at the base of a very gentle hill, lay the village of Siloa, a collection of around 70 thatched, single-story, timber-frame buildings, a mixture of houses, sheds, and tradesmen's shops, most of which doubled as dwellings. Smoke poured out of the stone chimneys and drifted lazily over the little settlement before dissipating above the dark pines of Rimwold Forest. 3 wide streets ran north and south between the rows of buildings. At the middle street's north end, on its west side, was the ploughman's shanty, and already various folk could be seen meandering in that general direction. This was quite customary in Siloa on any day of the week as evening approached. Girion clapped Aradis on the back and said, I'm going to head on down to the ploughman's shanty and chat with the fellows there a while. I suppose I'll see you in half an hour or so.
Aye,
Aradis replied.
First, I've got to go by the forge and see how Tarek is doing.
He looked down at the village, and a moment later he mumbled,
At least it looks like he hasn't burned the place down.
"Don't be silly. Tarek knows what he's doing for the most part. But, of course, he isn't a master blacksmith if that's what you're expecting of him."
No, he certainly isn't. And I only expect that he'd do his part. But Tarek is lazy.
"Compared to you, Aradis, anyone is lazy," Girion remarked, setting off down the hill. "See you at the shanty," he called as he waved. Aradis lingered there for a while watching Girion go on down the hill. It was somewhat restorative for him to stand in that spot and look out over the forest and the town, to look up at the magnificent sunset, and remember the days when life was simpler for him and his family. For there had been many joyous memories in lovely Siloa in times past, times not that long ago. And so, for perhaps 10 minutes, he stood there immersing himself in a past that had slipped away. But then his mind churned like a dark sea, and the present came back to the surface like a terrible monster. Then, deep in his gut, he felt a dreadful anxiety, an almost tangible disquiet surging up, and there was naught he could do to quell it. For he knew he must go home and face the reality of his broken situation, that of a lot he utterly despised, one of impoverishment, frustration, and a very real possibility of the death of his father. And so, heavy of heart, he marched off down the hill toward town and his father's forge. Aradis really did not want to go by the forge, but knew he must, for it was, in his estimation, an absolute certainty that Tarek had done something amiss, either from negligence or ignorance, and Aradis would probably have to rectify whatever errors his feckless brother had made. Yet the last thing he wanted was to get into another dispute with him. They had quarreled frequently of late, primarily because Aradis wanted desperately for Tarek to be more responsible and hard-working than he was.
He is 17, after all, and needs to take life more seriously.
Aradis thought to himself.
Especially in this time of need, when money is not to be had.
Indeed, the Kingblade family had to beg food off of neighbors more often than not, which flew directly in the face of everything Aradis believed about self-sufficiency. And so he had taken it upon himself to reform Tarek on a daily basis, with the ultimate aim of making things easier for his father. But both of the lads were rather hot-tempered, though Aradis had the greater heat, and so their quarrels could be quite grievous. And this, rather than helping matters, only upset his father all the more. Aradis could not bear to see his father be so dismayed again in his condition, so he resolved to do his best to rein in his ire if it began to show itself toward his brother. The central street that ran through Siloa was filled with its denizens, who were driving wagons to their sheds, pulling carts into alleyways, or stopping by shops of the tradesmen before they ambled down to the tavern or retired to spend the evening with their families. Aradis entered this main street, known as Lampler's Lane, through an alleyway between the houses of Faynard the tailor and Faynard's cousin, Gandrian the tanner, and then turned south toward the forge, which lay on the west side of the street on the southern edge of Siloa, forth from the end. The Kingblade home was right next to it, just to the south. Without knocking, Aradis simply flung open the door and walked inside the dimly lit forge. The window on the back was left open just a little to let in some light, and various tools and implements were strewn about on the earthen floor. The fire was still blazing, and Tarek was busy shaping a piece of glowing metal on the anvil.
"Hello, Aradis."
Tarek grunted as he swung the hammer. Tarek was of similar build to Aradis, but with shorter, darker hair and keen green eyes.
How goes it, Tarek?
Aradis inquired, with as much jollity as he could muster, which was not a great deal.
How many of Harwin's tools did you get repaired today?
Tarek knew what was coming, so he swung the hammer a few more times before replying.
"Some."
He finally answered.
and I know I should have finished all of them.
Aradis cut him off, snapping,
Of course you should have. And then some. What have you been doing all day? Gone off to meet up with your dear Ryella in the forest while I've been out breaking my back on the Ringmark farm?
He firmly regretted saying this even as the words left his mouth, for he could already sense his temper welling up, yet he felt helpless to do anything about it. Tarek thrust the molten metal he had been working on into a nearby wooden tub filled with water, and steam hissed up to the timbered ceiling of the forge. In great indignation, Tarek flung the hammer to the floor and retorted,
I suppose if I had myself put together as well as you do, Aradis, I would have gotten all the work at the forge done, and still had a full day to go out and work on the wheat harvest. And then I would have...
Aradis interjected angrily.
I've never claimed to be perfect, but money is scarce for us, and we need to get as much of it as we can, as fast as we can. No money means no food, Tarek. You know full well we lost nearly everything we had to those swine from the Sardolia last autumn, out collecting taxes for the Rufani, our so dearly beloved ruler.
This description of Valaris's potentate could hardly have been infused with greater sarcasm. Aradis continued his tirade.
And it just won't work for you to continue disregarding life and labor, as if the heavens would dump Garen after Garen into our laps free of charge. Money must be worked for, you lousy laggard. Everyone in our family seems to understand that but you. And what makes it even worse is that you know how hard Father worked to gain back what we lost, just to make it through the winter. And that's no doubt why he's in such a terrible state as he is now.
Must you constantly pretend as if I don't know what's going on with my own family?
Tarek lashed back.
Why should I not?
Aradis raged.
Where were you this winter when Father became sick? Did you come out with me to chop wood in that terrible blizzard? Or go hunting about in the forest when our food ran out? No! As I recall, you stayed at the house with our mother and Melora and feigned illness to get out of having to raise a finger and help for a change.
But I really was sick.
Tarek protested fiercely.
Certainly you were. Sick in the head. Our father needs us, Tarek. And if I had my way, you'd be out working in the fields, and I would be manning the forge. But I'm doing this for him, because he thought you needed to learn the trade. By the time I was your age, I could have run my own forge. But you were never around when Father tried to show you how to wield the hammer and tongs. You were always off in the forest and out in the fields and doing whatever you jolly well pleased. If I behaved like that, I'd hate to think what would happen to this family. I don't know if Mother and Melora could make it alone, but both of them are doing more than you've ever done. What with Melora working as a milkmaid 5 miles down the road, and Mother selling whatever articles of wool she can make a burna or 3 grand digs on. At the very least, just help us out until Father recovers, or we get enough money to be stable again. Then you can go back to your old ways. Maybe you can just wander off in the forest with those half-wit friends of yours, and then none of you will ever have to work again, and none of us will ever have to see your miserable, lazy self again.
Tarek was nearly boiling over, and he shouted back,
Maybe I just want to enjoy life while it lasts before we die like everybody else in this horrible little village, hated by all the other Barada, drained to the last Tarian, scrounging just to stay alive. Maybe I don't want to spend all my days working myself into the ground and doing what I'm supposed to do for nothing in return.
Nothing in return?
Aradis spat.
The love of your own family and the preservation of your own honor isn't enough for you? What ambition could you possibly have? Are you going to set out on some grand adventure, and through the gifts of conquest and fortune become Tarek the Magnificent, renowned throughout Orona?
Who knows what I might be if I were rid of you and your nagging arrogance? You always have thought too small, Aradis. You studied to become a skilled blacksmith. For what? To take care of your wife and children that you don't have? You haven't even caught the eye of a girl in Siloa because you're shoved so deep in your work and your responsibility and your blasted honor to notice anyone but yourself. Even if you had enough money to get married and support a family, you'd spend so much time working that you'd forget that you were married and that your wife had borne you children. Personally, though, if I were a marriageable young lady, I wouldn't give you the time of day. You're too much of a cocky jackass.
Tarek finished scathingly. Aradis could bear his wrath no longer, and he swung his fist at Tarek, his heart pounding. Dodging the blow, Tarek leapt aside and shoved Aradis into the wall. Metal tools from a nearby high shelf clanged to the floor, and Aradis bore full upon his younger brother. Just then, as they grappled furiously, hissing and spitting, the door to the forge swung open, and in stepped Girion Kingblade, their father.
Stop this madness immediately! Let him go, Aradis! Enough of this, Tarek!
He ordered his sons, and then began coughing, struggling to breathe. Aradis thrust Tarek from him, and then turned to his father, panting like an enraged animal.
Only for your sake will I let this scoundrel leave this forge without further injury. If you had heard some of the things he said, you would not have ordered me to let him go.
He said darkly.
Do you really think it does any good for you two to quarrel as you do?
Girion asked, catching his breath and looking back and forth between his sons.
If we're going to get through all this, we're not going to do it by shoving each other around the forge like drunken barbarians. Now surely, there cannot be such malice between you two, that you cannot look upon each other and forgive whatever spiteful things may have been said in moments of heat.
Tarek glared at his brother, his eyes still burning with anger. Aradis stared back, equally livid, and then turned to his father.
Let me put it this way, father. I count that accursed captain of the Sardulia, who scorned our very lives, dearer than your son Tarek.
That's another thing.
Tarek growled.
Where do you come off acting like you're such a hero for trying to fix a mess you're responsible for? If you hadn't shouted rude insults like a regular ruffian and thrown that bag of money right in Fergezi's face, it's almost certain he wouldn't have set our family's taxes so high. I'm surprised he didn't kill you right on the spot for something like that, as high up as he is in the government. It should send a pretty clear signal that serious lines have been crossed if the highest military official in this entire Barola, the whole district of Feldrin for crying out loud, has to make a personal visit to Siloa just to collect some taxes. Did it ever occur to you that things might just have been alright if certain people were able to keep themselves under control in the presence of...
Aradis took a step toward Tarek and angrily interrupted.
Well, I wasn't about to stand there like the rest of the cowards in this town and just let that scurrilous knave have his say and mock us menfolk so openly. I noticed you didn't say a single thing that day, oh bold and noble Tarek.
Of course not. I'm not an idiot like you, Aradis.
Tarek flashed as he got right in his brother's face.
You're just as much of a coward as that vermin Fergezi.
Aradis seethed.
Stop it now!
Girion shouted, and the lads, breathing heavily and narrowly having avoided yet another fierce tussle, slowly turned to face him. Girion tried to speak, but then coughed and wheezed some more. Aradis and Tarek stood there respectfully, waiting for what he had to say. Finally, when Girion could manage it, he said calmly,
You cannot mean that, Aradis. And you must never say such things, whatever else he may be. Tarek is your brother, and I will not have you speak of him in that manner.
Then tell him to no longer act and speak as a fool, and a traitor to everything we hold dear.
Aradis countered.
Aradis, you must not...
Girion began, but then started coughing uncontrollably again. Aradis knew that if he did not depart in haste, he would end up attacking Tarek again, so he shoved past his father and out the forge door, calling to him as he left.
You can listen to Tarek's false accounts of the quarrel now, and I will give you the true one later. I'm going down to the plowman's shanty to see Girion.
He heard Tarek shouting through the walls.
Now who's going off to gallivant about with his friends and leave his sick father alone for the night?
It took every last bit of Aradis' strength to not turn around, charge back into the forge, and give Tarek the beating of his life. But he steeled his resolve and marched on north up the street. When he had gone about halfway through town, he saw his sister, Melora, walking southward toward him, just now returning from the dairy farm up to the north where she worked as a milkmaid. She was a beautiful girl, 14 years in age, with long, wavy blonde hair and eyes of a winsome blue. She was walking along barefoot, clad in a simple brown skirt and a white tunic, looking as merry as she could be. Of their family, Melora was always the happiest, and even during the past winter when things had been especially hard, she would speak often of hope and of things getting better by and by. This had been of great comfort to Aradis during that time. As Melora approached, she remarked,
"You look as if your day has not gone well at all, Aradis."
He laughed in reply.
It's showing then, is it, Melora? Well, my day was actually going quite nicely until I got back to the forge and found that Tarek had gotten hardly a thing done since daybreak.
You didn't fight with him again, did you?
She asked concernedly as she came up to him. Aradis looked down at her, ashamed. He put his hand on her shoulder and said,
I didn't say anything that didn't absolutely need to be said.
How is father?
She anxiously inquired. Now Aradis was even more ashamed.
He came into the forge while we were fighting, and I thought it would be better to leave before I did something I really regretted.
What did you say to Tarek?
Melora pressed, looking into Aradis' shifting eyes. He hesitated, then replied,
Tarek said some horrible things about our family, and said he felt like everything he did for our sake amounted to nothing.
Surely not.
Melora exclaimed.
That might have been only how you took what he said, not how he meant it.
Whatever the case,
Aradis returned.
I could not listen to that rubbish and keep my head, so we fought again.
Well, let us thank the Danna that our father showed up.
Melora sighed.
I suppose,
Aradis said, then patted his sister on the back and started walking on down the street, calling out over his shoulder.
I'm going down to the shanty to see Girion for a bit. Say hello to Mother for me, and I'll see you at home.
Aradis!
Melora called after him. Aradis stopped and turned to look at her.
You really must stop fighting with Tarek, if only for father's sake. It's only tearing the family apart.
There'll be no more fighting, Melora. I promise.
Aradis assured her as he continued on down the street. As Aradis kept walking toward the plowman's shanty, he looked up at the sky and noticed that the dimness of twilight had fallen. The sky was calm, inexpressibly calm, over the plains, and to the west, only a faint glimmer of sunlight remained beyond the hills of Rimwold Forest. For a moment, Aradis thought he saw a streak of bluish-white light pass quickly over the forest to the west, perhaps a shooting star or something like that. On the western horizon, the silver sliver of the waxing crescent moon, Aereth, had now taken the place of golden Marda, the sun. As Aradis came up to the heavy wooden door of the plowman's shanty, he thought of how grateful he was for having run into Melora, for already his anger was somewhat assuaged, and perhaps after an hour or so of some genuinely jovial conversation with his friends, he would be able to go back home and make things up with Tarek. And so, thus heartened, he pulled open the oaken door and entered the bustling tavern. The plowman's shanty was a humble,
but inviting alehouse that contained 3 and a dozen large oak tables, a clean floor of wooden planks, and a great stone hearth with a roaring fire on the south wall. There were a few windows on every wall except the west wall, where the counter was. For behind the counter were a few storage rooms, and behind them a hallway connecting a half-dozen rooms that were available for travelers to spend the night. The hallway was accessed by a creaky old door at the southern end of the west wall in the corner of the tavern proper. Oren Berthaway, the proprietor of the place, a sturdy man with a thick brown beard and a perennially amused expression, stood leaning against the counter, talking to one of the farmers who came in daily for a drink and a chat. Blazing lanterns sat on all of the tables, but even so, the tavern was fairly dark, though still welcoming. About 40 people, both manfellows and maenas, that is, male and female menfolk, were seated in various places around the room, chatting away or roaming from table to table, catching snatches of all the latest gossip. Villagers would be trickling steadily in and out of the place for another hour or so. Aradis looked over to the right and saw that Girion was seated with 3 of their friends at their customary table against the north wall. Girion looked up from his conversation and nodded at Aradis, who then came over and sat on the bench beside him with his back to the wall.
That's exactly what I heard too,
their friend Coram Timberfall was saying. Coram was about Tarek's age, had a full head of unkempt blonde hair, and was thoroughly enamored with the sound of his own voice.
There was more trouble than they could handle up in Aragist. Well, you would know that better than anyone, Girion. Your family had to leave because of it.
Yes, people already didn't think much of menfolk in the capital when I was there.
Girion agreed.
And that was more than half a decade ago.
Well, it's much worse elsewhere.
Coram continued.
Neldon Broadbuckle told me that up in North Valaris, in Falzari or some such barola up on Cape Loresso.
Or was it Passera? Well, anyway, the authorities arrested some menfolk on false charges and had them executed the same day without a trial.
If I were you, I wouldn't believe everything you hear from Neldon Broadbuckle.
Their less loquacious friend Talus Pesselman piped in.
Or anything for that matter, unless it's about food or sleep, things which dear Neldon knows quite intimately. I'm actually surprised you need to be reminded of how unreliable Neldon is, Coram, since you've known him for years. But still, I've heard too much about other Narthana, other kindreds, treating menfolk poorly to not believe there's some genuine hatred out there for our kind. For example, just take that run of uppity elven tax collectors who came by here last fall and milked the whole village for every Tarian they could get.
Until the Siloa cow ran dry.
Their witty companion Darman Barnwain chimed in.
It's not so enjoyable to go around guzzling up menfolk monies when you know you're going to get an earful from the likes of Aradis Kingblade.
Let's not bring that up right now, Darman.
Aradis moaned as he exasperatedly rubbed his eyes.
Why not?
Coram exclaimed.
That's something you ought to be proud of, Aradis. Telling those elven louts off when no one else would. Though, of course it didn't turn out so well after you'd mouthed off to 3 separate tax collectors. And Captain Fergesi of the Sardolia was sent to personally take care of the so-called insurrection in Siloa. Exactly,
mumbled Aradis.
But that was really something, you know.
Talus remarked.
Chucking your family's taxes right at his noggin. That took a lot of courage.
Or stupidity,
Aradis muttered, wishing now that he had just gone for a quiet walk instead of coming down to the shanty. That was just like his friends, talking about things they knew annoyed him.
Lucky for you, Fergesi's son Corello calmed him down. Or you'd probably be dead, eh?
Darman laughed.
Can we just talk about something else?
Aradis asked, highly aggravated now.
Like what we're all going to do to Forgezi when he returns this spring?
Darman offered.
Oh, I do hope he comes back soon.
Coram started up again.
I'll tax his ugly face till he's sorrier than a yeti in the heat of the bush belt.
How are you going to manage that, Coram?
The ever-jocular Darman teased.
You couldn't win a fight with a bunny rabbit. Besides, you don't really think trouncing one of this entire Barola's most highly regarded military officials would go unnoticed, do you? The whole thing is already bad enough as it is.
Would you like to see me beat a bunny rabbit?
Coram queried, annoyed.
Go out and catch one, Darman, and I'll show you a thing or two.
Catch your own rabbit.
Darman pertly retorted.
I've got better things to do.
Of course you do.
Coram said, rolling his eyes.
But, as I was saying a minute ago, things are getting bad for us menfolk, and our friends are few and far between among the other kindreds. Think about it. When's the last time you heard about a dwarf, a gnome, an elf, or what have you standing up for the menfolk? Hasn't happened in our lifetime, and the druids are the worst of the lot. They'd like to see us all dead, I'm sure. Every last one of us.
The druids were by far the worst in Aragest.
Girion noted.
Downright nasty to us and all the other menfolk in our quarter of the city.
Well, let's all be grateful to the Danna that few of the other Narthana ever come through Siloa.
Coram exulted, raising his mug of ale.
Keeps us out of trouble, it does.
I'll drink to that.
Talus said, gulping down a large swig of his own ale.
You'll drink to anything, Talus.
Darman chuckled. The friends continued chattering away while Aradis sat in silence, still plagued by his own mournful thoughts, absent-mindedly itching his beard, as he often did when greatly troubled by something. This had not gone unnoticed by Girion, who leaned over to Aradis and asked quietly,
How's your father?
Aradis said nothing for a moment, and then whispered back,
Not well, as usual. I went back by the forge to check on things, and well, I'll tell you about it later. I'm going to go up and get myself some ale.
Girion clapped Aradis on the back as the latter got up and then engaged again in the other's banter. Meanwhile, Aradis walked up to the north side of the counter, the short side, and motioned to the bartender, Orin, who was pouring out drinks for others a ways down. Just then, Aradis noted a stranger in a dark brown traveler's cloak. His hood was pulled over his head in such a manner that his face could not be seen, and he was leaning against the counter not many feet down from Aradis, facing the west wall. Wayfarers were not terribly uncommon at the plowman's shanty, for often people traveling north or south in this part of Valaris would take the byway that skirted along the edge of Rimwold Forest and thus would pass through Siloa. Aradis surmised that this stranger was most likely a manfellow, as hardly any other sort of Barada would routinely be found in a wholly mannish tavern. Under normal circumstances, he would have at least greeted the fellow, but in such a depressed condition as he now found himself, he could not even muster the cordiality to offer a polite hello. As Aradis stood there, he thought again of how miserably he had erred in quarreling with his brother, and how utterly angry and ashamed he was that his father had walked in on him and Tarek, two grown men, wrestling like stupid children. Just then, Orin came up with a mug of ale and plopped it in front of Aradis, who tossed him a copper garin, which Orin deftly inserted into his apron as he walked off to tend to other customers. Aradis took a long gulp of the ale, and as he did so, the stranger in the cloak abruptly said in a low, imperial voice,
I would hope for much better than rage and brawling from a son of Darien Kingblade.
To say that Aradis was taken aback by this would be a terrible understatement. Dumbfounded, he held the ale in his mouth, set his mug on the counter, slowly swallowed, and, shocked beyond belief, said,
Excuse me?
The man did not turn to look at him. He simply said, directly and with such authority in his voice that one dare not question him,
Aradis, I need to speak to you outside.
Then he turned and walked over to the door and went out into the night. Aradis had never been so stupefied in all his life. He could hardly have spoken if he had tried with all of his might. So struck was he by the absolute insanity of what had just happened. All his thoughts about Siloa, his family, his friends, the troubles of Villaris, and all else besides, were strangely expelled from his mind. He could not think, he could not speak, and yet he could not stay. It was as if all his powers of volition had been annihilated by the sheer bizarreness of that brief encounter, and he had no choice but to obey the man's request. It certainly would not do to let him slip away, never to be seen again. If Aradis could not get some answers about who the man was, or how he had known his name, and even seemed to be reading his very thoughts, he would be driven out of his mind. Already, he was reaching desperately for some sort of mundane explanation, such as that the man was an old friend of his father's, and had spoken with him before coming down to the tavern. But when would he have done that? Although it was possible, it wasn't very plausible, as there wouldn't have been much time. And why would he be so secretive? Had the man already been standing at the counter when Aradis first entered? He could not remember. And the more he tried, the less sure he was about everything. And so, he reluctantly turned and headed for the door. Just then, Girion raised his head and noticed that his friend was leaving. Aradis motioned with his hand that everything was all right. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the darkened street. He looked around in all directions for the stranger and saw him a ways south up the street. The man was looking at Aradis, and as soon as he saw that Aradis had spotted him, he disappeared into an alleyway that led west toward the edge of town. At this point, Aradis was concerned that perhaps the man meant to draw him out and then do him some ill, such as robbing or even killing him. But even this possibility did not faze his curiosity.
I must find out who this man is,
he thought to himself.
or I shall wonder about this for the rest of my days.
So he put his hand on the dagger he always carried at his side, went up the street, and turned into the shadowy alleyway. Once there, he passed through it and continued out of town, across a field and then on to the slope that rose west of town up toward the meadow at the edge of Rimwold Forest, a place that had been dubbed Midsummer Meadow by the people of Siloa, for several festivals were held there at the height of summer. He could see the man nearly at the top of the slope, his form barely outlined in the pale moonlight. Aradis began hiking up the hill after him, and when the stranger disappeared from sight over the crest, he climbed all the faster. When he reached the top, he saw the man once more, this time on the far side of the meadow, now at the very edge of the forest. Once more, as soon as the man knew Aradis had seen him, he passed into the shadows of the enormous pines of Rimwold Forest. At this juncture, Aradis knew that if he really were in his right mind, he should have turned around. It is, of course, ill-advised for anyone, no matter how clever or strong he may think himself to be, to wander off into the forest in the dark of night at the invitation of a complete stranger. But Aradis could not shake the maddening thought that if he did not discover the truth about this man, he should regret it until his dying day. His heart pounded in his chest, so loudly that it nearly drowned out the soft humming of insects in the moonlit meadow. But he had made up his mind. He would simply have to trust that everything would be all right, and if it were not, he would do his best to make it out of this alive. And this, he thought, was not unmanageable, for it could not be said that he was shabby with a blade. Thus, he held his dagger tighter still, ran across the meadow, and ducked into the cover of the forest. He peered into the shadows, using the weird patches of moonlight that lay upon the forest floor to aid his vision. But he did not see the stranger anywhere. Cautiously, he pressed farther in, and when he was perhaps 200 feet deep into the forest, he came to a clearing that he knew quite well. There he saw the man standing on the far side, facing him dead on. Aradis gripped the dagger as tightly as he could, ready for almost anything. Still, he was terrified to his very marrow. The stranger then cast the hood from his face, and thus was revealed a somber visage of olive complexion. He was a man-fellow, sure enough, just as Aradis had suspected. His head was crowned with dark curly hair and adorned with an elegant mustache and beard. In the darkness of the forest glade, it seemed almost as if the man's eyes reflected the dim blue sheen of the moonlight.
You needn't fear me, Aradis,
the man said in a deep voice.
I have not come here to harm you, but to bring you a message which will ultimately be for your benefit and the benefit of many.
How do you know my name? And how do you know my father?
Aradis stammered. The man stared back at him, now silent as the trees which stood around them.
Who are you?
Aradis demanded, his voice rising.
I am Nagello, one of the Chassidim,
the man replied.
And I have come to you with a message of great urgency.
Aradis now released his hold on the dagger. He was utterly flabbergasted.
A message? From whom? Who are the Chassidim?
The Chassidim are of the Hadathi. They are the messengers of the Danna.
Aradis was more flabbergasted still. He cried out, stumbling repeatedly over his own words.
It cannot be. The Hadathi are... well, they're from the Hadra. Yes, the place of the immaterial. And you're one of them? How can this be? One of the Hadathi? Beings of the invisible world? More powerful than the greatest of the Barada? And you have spoken with the Danna himself? Can it really be so? But I thought the Danna was... well, I always thought he was more the sort of being who wouldn't... well, that he wouldn't... Are you really one of the Hadathi?
At that very moment, Nagello burst into a blaze of blue light, and his aspect was transfigured. He still had the form of a man, though he was naked now, save for a dazzling garment around his loins, and he radiated an unspeakably fierce light, a deep blue flame. His form was regal in every regard. It was the very pinnacle of human perfection embodied. From a purely material perspective, it might have been described as translucent, in that it was not fully physical. But in another strange sense, it was densely immaterial, more substantial than any physical object could ever be. And now Nagello's eyes burned brighter than the summer sun at midday. Aradis only looked upon him for a moment, before he collapsed to the ground, and blackness overtook him.